Respected Vice Chancellor Professor Bhatt, Dr. Valiathan, dignitaries of Manipal Academy of Higher Education, family members of Professor Achyuta Rao, eminent scholars, students, and teachers. I would like to thank the Professor DSA Achyuta Rao Centenary Program Advisory Board and the Manipal Center of Philosophy and Humanities for organizing this national conference on ancient Indian history and for giving me the privilege of being part of it. I especially extend my thanks to Mr. DSA Prasanna and Dr. Nikhil Govind. It is a great honor to be part of an event commemorating an exceptional scholar and teacher such as the late Professor DSA Achyuta Rao. I think that organizing a series of meaningful academic events such as these and producing fine publications on a regular basis is the best way of remembering him. There is a long and rich Indian historiographical tradition focusing on the regions of the subcontinent. This tradition has played a very valuable role in helping us understand the details and uneven textures of our constructions of Indian history. Professor Achyuta Rao himself made significant contributions to the history of Mysore. Much more work needs to be done in this regard, especially in the case of regions whose historical profiles are still dimly known. Simultaneously, I would like to emphasize in this lecture, at the current juncture, there is an urgent need for Indian historians to move beyond the subcontinental frame and to view history in a global perspective. I will discuss this issue with special reference to India and Southeast Asia. India-Southeast Asia relations were of great interest to the nationalist historians such as R.C. Majumdar, who examined them using the frameworks of Greater India and Indianization. The Indianization model was not only favored by Indian historians. The famous French scholars, Georges Sédès, used the term Hinduization, which was translated into Indianization in the English translation of his important book. Sédès talked about further India, land exterior, and he observed, and I'm quoting, the importance of studying the Indianized countries of Southeast Asia, which, let us repeat, were never political dependencies of India, but rather cultural colonies, lies above all in the observation of the impact of Indian civilization on the primitive civilizations, unquote. The Indianization hypothesis had its critics. For instance, O.W. Walters argued that while there was no denying the Indian influence on Southeast Asia, the presuppositions and implications of the Indianization model were unacceptable. Quote, "The study of Southeast Asia must surely be for only one reason, to improve our knowledge of the region for its own sake." Unquote. There was much more, Walters argued, to Southeast Asian history than foreign influence. There was an important, what he called, something else. Further, when influences from various countries arrived in Southeast Asia, including Indian influences, he pointed out that these materials tended to be fractured and restated and therefore drained of their original significance, a process that he termed localization. Unfortunately, when critical changes in the historiography of Southeast Asia were taking place, Indian historians were nowhere in the picture. In the critique of nationalist historiography from the 1960s onwards, the Greater India model was critiqued and rejected. Rather than being replaced by a more sophisticated understanding, it was replaced by indifference. I see this as part of an inward regional turn in ancient Indian historiography. During the 1980s, pan-Indian models and histories made way for a greater focus on the regions and their interactions, especially during what is known as the early medieval period, between circa 600 to 1300 CE. This led to important breakthroughs in understanding the unevenness of political and cultural processes across the subcontinent. However, connections between the Indian subcontinent and other parts of the world were largely ignored, except by scholars working on long-distance trade. Today, discussing Asian interactions has once again become popular, even fashionable. The important question is, through what perspectives are Indian scholars going to view them? We cannot fall back on old attitudes of cultural chauvinism. What is required is a new kind of historiographical engagement, acknowledging the contributions of the earlier generation of Indian historians, but also absorbing the many critical ways in which the historiography has moved forward since then. When we talk about Southeast Asia, we must be aware of the fact that, as in South Asia, there is a great deal of cultural variety within that macro region. Looking beyond trade, we need to examine broader cultural interactions, reflected, for instance, in religion and art. But we also need to examine the role of conflict and war in Asian history, reflected, for instance, in the protracted Chinese conflict with the Dai Viet and the Chola naval expedition against Sri Vijaya. Finally, we need to broaden the frame beyond Asia and engage with the many webs of interaction that crisscrossed Asia, Africa, and Europe in the pre-modern world. Today, I will focus on three specific themes, which represent a few of many possible entry points into understanding ancient Indian history as part of global history. The three themes are Asian Buddhist networks, epigraphic practices of South and Southeast Asian kingdoms, and the travels of legal and political ideas. I would especially like to emphasize the need for Indian historians to work on the movement of ideas in the ancient world, and for a comparative perspective that takes into account cultural connectivity and similarity, as well as specificity and difference. Let's look first at evolving Buddhist networks. Religious transmission, initially of Hinduism and Buddhism, and later of Islam, is one of the important aspects of India-Southeast Asia connections. I will focus on evolving Buddhist networks, which have to be situated within the historical context of expanding commercial and cultural interactions across Asia. Early epigraphic evidence of these networks comes from South India. The site of Nagarjunakonda in Guntur district, Andhra Pradesh, represents Vijayapuri, the capital of the Ikshvaku dynasty, which ruled in the Krishna Valley between circa 210 to 325 CE. One of the striking features of this ancient city is the fact that it had many Buddhist monasteries associated with different schools, as well as several Hindu temples. Royal women played an important role in patronizing the Buddhist stupa monastery complexes that dotted the cityscape. Inscriptions indicate that some of these monasteries had a marked cosmopolitan profile. The most important Buddhist complex at the site was the Mahachaitya, which seems to have enshrined a Buddha relic. This is the Mahachaitya as it was recreated, reassembled on the hill, Nagarjunakonda, the hill after the Nagarjun Sagar Dam was built and became operational. So this is the most important Buddhist site, Site 1, and we know from inscriptions that the most prominent among the donors at this site was a royal woman named Chanti Siri, who belonged to the Ikshvaku royal family. For our purposes, it is very significant that inscriptions found at the mandapa associated with the Mahachaitya refer to the Mahavihara and the Mahabhikkhu Sangha, the great community of Buddhist monks who had assembled from various lands. An inscription on the floor of a temple located to the east of the Mahachaitya once again refers to the Mahachaitya Sangha, the Mahabhikkhu Sangha, who had renounced the world and had assembled from various countries. This suggests that Nagarjuna-konda was one of the earliest centers of Asian Buddhism in the 3rd and 4th centuries. Apart from royal women, there were also several non-royal patrons at Vijayapuri. The most prominent was a woman named Bodhisiri, who was the chief patron of the apsidal temple associated with the Chula Dhammagiri Vihara. And we know from inscriptions that she also patronized several other Buddhist establishments at other sites in the region. An inscription tells us that this temple was constructed for the benefit of the Tamba Pannaka Acharyas, who had gladdened through their teaching the lands of Kashmir, Gandhar, China, Chilat, Tosali, Avaranta, Vanga, Vanavasi, Yavana, Damila, Palura, and the island of Tambapanni. At another monastic site at Nagarjuna-konda, an inscription on a Buddha Pada, a stone carved with the Buddha's footprints, refers to the installation of this pair of feet for the welfare and happiness of all beings. And this vihar is said to belong to the monks who were Vibhajyavadins, Mahaviharavasins, and again the same formula occurs, that they had caused delight, pasada, to the people of Kashmir, Gandhar, Yavana, Vanavasa, and Tamraparni Dvipa. It seems that some of the major Buddhist complexes at Vijayapuri had connections with Sri Lankan monastic communities. That's the point I'd like to emphasize. And this is part of a larger story of interactions between Sri Lanka and South India, more specifically Andhra. There are textual parallels, for instance, in the Deepavams and Mahavams, to the geographical terms mentioned in the above earlier mentioned inscriptions. And it has been suggested that we should not take them literally, but see them as rhetorical devices asserting widespread spiritual conquest. This is indeed an important cautionary point. However, if we compare the inscriptions of Nagarjuna-konda with other Buddhist sites, such as Sanchi and Bharhut in central India, or Kanaganahalli and Amaravati in South India, no other site has such a strong stamp of internationalism. It is interesting to note that the Sri Lankan chronicle, the Mahavams, connects Sri Lankan Buddhism and the establishment of kingship on the island with North India through the legendary Vijaya and Ashok's son Mahinda and daughter Sanghamita. The centuries-old monastic connections between South India and Sri Lanka are ignored. This Mahavam's view of history, which erases the connections with South India, has been questioned. More on Sri Lankan monks. Sri Lankan monks participated in aggressive proselytizing activity and over time assumed managerial roles in monasteries in various parts of the Indian subcontinent. Their first important foothold was in Vijayapuri, and there was a steady increase in their presence in Indian monasteries. This can be seen at the Mahabodhi temple in Bodh Gaya and which was another important center of Buddhist convergence. Here, there are two inscriptions of a Sri Lankan monk named Mahanaman. One of these, composed in Sanskrit verse, refers to Mahanaman's building of a temple of the Buddha at this place. The other inscription refers to this monk's donation of a Buddha image. A damaged two-line inscription of Prakhyata Kirti, 6th-7th century, on the railing refers to a monk from Lanka Dvipa who had certain acts of worship performed here in order to attain Buddhahood and for others to attain enlightenment. The Chinese monk Xuanzang in the 7th century tells us of several Sri Lankan monks living in a monastery built by a Sri Lankan king at Bodh Gaya. And there is a 9th or 10th century inscription on an 18-armed stone image of a Vajrayan goddess, which is today located in the Mahant's Mutt near the Mahabodhi temple, which seems to record the gift by a monk from the Abhayagiri monastery in Sri Lanka. Bodh Gaya had become much more than an important Indian Buddhist site. It had become a major Asian Buddhist site. And this becomes clear especially from the fact that between the 11th and 18th centuries, Burmese kings belonging to various dynasties connected themselves with Mahabodhi in order to enhance their prestige and sent several so-called repair missions to the temple. And it seems that non-royal Burmese were also visiting the temple. Eventually, Mahabodhi became an important symbolic center and pilgrimage destination for pious monks and laity from Sri Lanka, Burma, China, and Tibet. The great symbolic importance of Mahabodhi in the Asian Buddhist world is also evident from the building of various Mahabodhi temples in other parts of Asia, and by the fact that the temple at Bodh Gaya is represented on large numbers of Buddhist plaques and tablets found in many lands. Amravati in Guntur district, Andhra Pradesh, was another center for Sri Lankan monastic activity. The direct evidence for this comes from the medieval period, but the beginnings of the process probably go back to earlier times. A 14th century Sinhalese inscription found at Gadaladenia in Kandy district, Sri Lanka, refers to gifts made by a Sri Lankan monk at Amravati. The crucial thing is that in Sri Lanka, a strong symbiotic relationship between the state and Sangha emerged early in the day. As a result, the place of the island in Asian Buddhist networks steadily increased. Apart from monks, political elites too played an important role in forging links with India, the Buddhist homeland. Inscriptions indicate that Asian Buddhist networks received an impetus through transregional patronage and pilgrimage. So we have, for instance, a copper plate that records the gift made by a Pala king at Nalanda at the request of the Shailendra king of Suvarnabhumi. And then at Nagapattinam, we have the two sets of copper plates, which refer to land grants by Rajaraja I and by Kulotunga Chola to a monastery set up by a Sri Vijaya king. Sri Vijaya was based in Sumatra but extended its influence beyond that at various points of time. So trans-regional patronage of Southeast Asian kings at Indian sites, Indian Buddhist sites also was important. If we look at the timeline of Asian Buddhist networks, although their roots go back to earlier centuries, they seem to have expanded significantly during the Gupta and post-Gupta periods. Archaeology shows the existence of monasteries at places such as Sarnath, Ajanta, Sanchi, and Amravati, and Buddhist images of fine quality, especially those of the Sarnath school, belong to this period. The Tamil epic Mani-Meghalai, 5th, 6th century, is deeply imbued with Mahayana Buddhist ideas. The religious milieu reflected in this text is a multi-religious one and emphasizes connections with Ratnadweep, Sri Lanka, and with Southeast Asia, especially Java. Chinese sources are especially useful in reconstructing Asian Buddhist networks. The monks Fa Xian and Xuanzang, who played an important role in the transmission of Buddhism from India to China, represent significant stages in the process of monastic interactions between the two lands. Instead of reading their accounts as a series of factual statements, sometimes incorrect, about India in the 5th and 7th centuries respectively, we need to take into account their perspective, purpose, and audience. Fa Xian's record of Buddhist countries is much more than a personal travelogue. The pilgrim left Chang'an in China in 399 CE and returned about 14 years later, a very long journey, and he was a fairly elderly man when he launched forth on this journey. He frequently refers to the element of Buddhist cosmopolitanism. So at various places in his record of Buddhist countries, he talks about how kings of different lands had sent, for instance, at a place called Hidda, which is somewhere in the northwest, Fashion tells us that kings of other lands sent envoys to make offerings at the stoop enshrining the skull relic at Hidda. Monks from different quarters came to attend the opulent Panchavarshika ceremony held by the king of Kasha. At Jetavana Vihara, he tells us, kings and people of different countries competed with each other to make offerings. Fashian tells us that monk scholars from the four quarters came to a monastery at Pataliputra. At Ramagrama, he tells us that a foreign monk had recently taken over the decaying stoop and convinced the king to build a monastery. Fashian also tells us that he stayed in Sri Lanka for 2 years. The map shows you Fashian's journey. You can see the long overland journey and then the return, which is by sea. So Fashian tells us that he stayed in Sri Lanka for 2 years, and he talks about the Abhayagiri and Mahavihara monasteries there. He tells us of the deep respect that the king and the people on the island had for Buddhism and the great wealth of the monasteries. On the island, he tells us that he obtained various texts that were unavailable in India. Fashian indicates very clearly that Buddhism in Sri Lanka was a strong religion with close links with political patrons and an important place in Asian Buddhist networks. In the 7th century, Xuanzang also talks about Sri Lanka, but he seems to have got most or much of this information from hearsay from monks who were fleeing or leaving the island. Other Chinese sources too reflect the evolving and expanding Buddhist networks across Asia. These include biographies of famous monks. We read in these biographies of Gunavarman, 5th century monk, who belonged to the royal family of Kashmir, traveled to Sri Lanka and Java, and on to Nanking. A monk named Gunabhadra, 5th, 6th century, traveled to Sri Lanka and thence took the sea route to Canton. Vajrabodhi in the 8th century was based in Nalanda and traveled extensively within India, going on to Sri Lanka, and also accompanied a mission sent by the Sri Lankan king to the Chinese emperor. Vajrabodhi's student Amogha Vajra was born in Sri Lanka, traveled to China, and returned to the island after several years. These are a few of the many monks who journeyed between East Asia and South Asia. Another indication of the evolving Asian Buddhist networks comes from Bao Chang's Biographies of Buddhist Nuns, a 5th century work. This tells us about the formal establishment of the order of nuns in China. Usually when we talk about Buddhism, we focus on the male monastic order. But this very interesting reference in this Chinese work tells us that the first proper dual ordination ceremony, that is, ordination by both monks and nuns, of Chinese nuns, was only possible when nuns from Sri Lanka reached China. This is when the Sri Lankan nun Devasara and her sister nuns participated in the first proper dual ordination ceremony in 433. The first Chinese nun, we are told, was Sen Guo, and she was ordained by Devasara and her fellow or sister nuns from Sri Lanka, and by a group of monks headed by Sanghavarman from India. In later times, monastic reordination practices connected Sri Lanka and Burma, with Burmese monks being sent for periodic purification to Sri Lanka for reordination. The Sangha forged strong ties with ruling elites outside the subcontinent, but was less successful in India. In spite of the absence of substantial political patronage, the Indian monasteries nevertheless remained important as they represented Buddhism's homeland. Control over important Indian Buddhist sacred places and monasteries was especially important, and the Sri Lankan monks were extremely successful in this. Some of the Buddhist centers that flourished in the medieval period are those which had international connections. Of course, there are exceptions, such as Sanchi in central India. But overall, we see an expanding Asian Buddhist network in which texts, monks, relics, images, and ideas traveled across the many regions of Asia. Let us move to the second theme of my lecture, royal epigraphic practice. And I'm going to just compare royal inscriptions from India and Southeast Asia. Although many dynastic origin myths in Southeast Asian lands connect them with Indian elites, the spread of elements of Indic political culture to Southeast Asia was not the result of political conquest or domination. Inscriptions in the Sanskrit language and Indic scripts with Indic elements are found in many parts of Southeast Asia at the time of the emergence and development of monarchical states. In Champa, which is central and South Vietnam, the Vo Can inscription, its dates estimates range from the 2nd to the 5th century. The Vo Can inscription, which contains of a eulogy of a ruler named Sri Mara, especially his generosity to his kinsmen, is written in Sanskrit, including 2 verses in Kavya style. The style of royal inscriptions in Champa became increasingly ornate, and we see a synthesis of Sanskritic and charm elements in language and ideas. In land grants to temples from the 5th century onwards, there are long and elaborate genealogies and eulogies, rather, of gods and kings. We see Sanskrit elements in the names of rulers, the descriptions of kings and official designations, the use of the Shaka era, references to Indian political ideas, references to the Mahabharata and Ramayana, the Buddha, and elaborate details of Hindu mythology. I'm talking about the inscriptions from Central and South Vietnam. We also see the Indic political vocabulary of the Arthashastra tradition. There are also technical terms such as Akshaya Nivi and expressions stating that the grant should last as long as the sun and the moon, which are found commonly in land grants in India. Excuse me. The early inscriptions of Java, and these are in Sanskrit and Javanese, use different script. Pallava Grantha, Nagari of the Eastern Indian variety, and the Javanese Kavi script. And many of these Javanese inscriptions are dated in the Shaka era. Land grants known as Simas begin in the 8th century. They are inscribed on stone or on copper plates, and they have some of the standard ingredients of the Indian copper plate charters. They sometimes begin with the auspicious Om or Swasti. There are references to Manu, the characters of the Mahabharata and Ramayana, references to the 4 Varnas and Ashramas. Some grants have a list of exemptions, which we refer to as pariharas in the Indian context. But the nature of these exemptions is very different, usually, from those found in India. All this shows that while the idea of the land grant document associated with tax exemptions and privileges as part of royal policy seems to have come from India, the contents, details, and expressions were entirely Javanese. Were such inscriptions composed by Brahmin migrants from India, by their descendants, or by Javanese trained in Indic style composition, language, and scripts? There are references to teachers coming from Gauda, Gurjaradesh, and Sri Lanka. And these references indicate the multiple religious and cultural confluences that were converging in Java. Imprecations, these are warnings in the form of a curse, are well known from royal land grants in India. But the imprecations in Southeast Asian inscriptions are different from their Indic counterparts. Let's take, for instance, the Malay inscriptions of Sri Vijaya. This is from Sumatra. The language is Malay, but there are many Sanskrit words. Let's just look at one inscription. It's a famous 7th century inscription called the Telagu Batu inscription. This is the longest Sri Vijaya inscription. This consists of 28 lines, and it consists entirely of an imprecation. That is, it is a long series of curses. And there is a long list of people who obviously were seen as political threats to the ruler. And as you can see on the slide, the stone has these snake hoods on top, and there is a spout below the inscription. I'll just come to that in a minute. So the inscription mentions several important officials and members of the royal household, including terms familiar from the Indian context, such as Yuvaraja, Dandanayaka, Senapati, etc. But there are also several elements that are specific to Sri Vijaya, such as references to Bhupatis, vassals, and Datu, district-level chiefs. All these people are told that if they plot against the king, they will be killed by this curse. Now, as I said, this, if you look at the inscription, the stone, snake hoods on top, 7 snake hoods, cobra hoods, and apart from that, you have the spout at the bottom. And what we can surmise is that there was a performative aspect to this inscription, that it is very possible, in fact likely, that all these potential rebels were made to assemble. Perhaps there was a ceremonial reading out of this imprecation, this warning, and water was probably poured over the inscription, and these potential rebels, perhaps one by one, they may have been made to line up, and they may have been asked to come and drink the water that had flown over the stone and which had absorbed the curse in a very, very direct way. So this inscription, this is a Sanskrit inscription. There are Sanskrit words it's in Malay, there are Sanskrit words in this inscription, but nothing like this has been found anywhere in India. So what we can see here is yet another example of an inscription in which there are Indic elements, but the political structure and political ideology that the inscription reflects are unique to the Sri Vijaya context. The third and last issue I would like to say a little bit about are the travels of legal and political ideas. There is considerable information about the flows of commodities across Asia, Africa, and Europe. Much less is known about the movement of ideas. Sheldon Pollock has directed attention to the emergence of the Sanskrit cosmopolis and the travels of the Sanskrit and language and Sanskrit texts within the subcontinent and beyond it to other parts of Asia. He has discussed the universality of the Shastric tradition, which claimed to embody knowledge that was applicable at all times, in all places. O. W. Walters has suggested also that the universality and flexibility of the Indian Shastric tradition made it very amenable to appropriation in different geographically and culturally distant and different contexts. For instance, the frequent use of the word adi at the end of lists in the Sanskrit normative texts gave them a great deal of flexibility. And we know, for instance, if you take the example of the Arthashastra, how much pragmatic flexibility there was in a text such as that. So we do have some ideas about intellectual movements and transmission, absorption, localization, as far as the history of ideas in South and Southeast Asia goes, but there is much more that we need to learn in terms of the agents and details of this complex process. In my recent book, Political Violence in Ancient India, I have analyzed the political ideas, especially those related to violence, punishment, and war, produced over the momentous 1200 years between 600 BCE and 600 CE. I have discussed, for instance, the Mahabharata and Ramayana, the works of Kalidas, Kautilya's Arthashastra, the Niti Sar, the Jatakas, and Panchatantra. Some of these texts, such as the epics, Jatakas, and the Panchatantra, are found in a variety of non-textual forms as well, visual forms, and in the case of the epics, performative forms. We know well that the influence of these texts extended well beyond the ancient period. The interesting thing is that the texts that had enormous impact on political ideas within India in the long term are the ones that traveled widely outside the subcontinent as well. Sanskrit Kavya, for instance, the works of Kalidas, Bharavi, Mayura, etc., and works on poetics, such as Dandin's Kavyadarsha, works on lexicography, such as the Amarakosha, works on grammar, were also known in various parts of Southeast Asia. The 10th century Pre-Roop inscription from Cambodia, a very long Sanskrit inscription, which uses a variety of poetic meters, has 4 verses with clear allusions to Kalidasa's Raghuvansh. The 13th century Javanese text, called the Somanasantaka, tells the story of Prince Aja and Princess Indumati, who feature in the Raghuvansh. The travels and transformations of the Mahabharata and Ramayana are among the most often cited and studied aspects of the cultural interface between India and Southeast Asia, and I will not go into those details here. I would just like to say a few words about 2 other sorts of texts. These are legal texts and the Panchatantra. The legal traditions of Southeast Asia reflect the influence of Sanskrit Dharmashastra and Arthashastra traditions, Islamic Sharia, and Chinese legal traditions. These were amalgamated and recast to suit their Southeast Asian cultural contexts. And texts like the Manusmriti, Arthashastra, and Niti Sar were especially important. The Burmese texts, known as the Dhammatats, drew inspiration from both Brahminical as well as Buddhist traditions. They refer to the Buddha, they begin with an adoration to the Buddha. They also dip into the Jataka traditions for political ideas. They refer to Manu, but the Manu of the Burmese Dhammatats is different from the Indian Manu. In Burma, he is described as a minister of the first king, Mahasammata. As far as its approach to the institution of kingship is concerned, the Burmese texts do not focus too much on the king's ceremonial aspects. They really focus on his right to collect taxes and to punish, and they deal in detail with that. What is interesting is that Burmese society, like many Southeast Asian societies, were cognatic. That is, they recognize descent both through the mother and the father. Therefore, some of those very patriarchal aspects of texts like the Manusmriti were of no great interest to the Burmese. And so, for instance, the centrality of the production of male heirs, the importance of the production of sons, was not relevant to Burmese society. So the Burmese Dhammatats simply ignore those aspects of the Sanskrit Dharmashastra. And we can see the influence of Dharmashastra and political ideas in such texts in various other contexts as well. We can see the influence on Javanese, Balinese texts, and I won't go into those details here. I'd like to go on to somewhat less dry and more interesting text, and that is the Panchatantra. And this is something I've discussed in great detail in my book, Political Violence in Ancient India. Just a little bit about the Panchatantra, which means the 5 books or the 5 topics. And as I've pointed out, the Panchatantra takes on political issues through stories which are humorous, but also very violent. The date of this Sanskrit treatise is debated. It may have been composed in the 3rd century. Vishnu Sharman, the putative author, is said to have composed this work after having studied all the works on governance. So the text connects itself with the intellectual tradition of Nripa Shastra and Artha Shastra, and it describes itself as a text on governance, a treatise on governance of great charm, which it is. And it is fully conversant with the conceptual vocabulary of Dharma Shastra and Artha Shastra. But because the Panchatantra frames its teaching within dramatic, witty, and entertaining stories, most of them are animal characters, its flavor is unique. The Panchatantra contains a pragmatic set of teachings that cater both to the political and the personal and everyday, especially discussing dealings between the weak and the strong and how to get the better of rivals and opponents. It emphasizes clear and quick thinking, using strategy to protect one's interests, the importance of hard work, and completing tasks that have been begun. Who could quarrel with these teachings? The Panchatantra stories have a subversive element. They're very different from the Jataka stories, which also have animal characters, but which emphasize Buddhist virtues like compassion and self-sacrifice. Many of the Panchatantra stories, in fact, go against pious platitude. They argue that lying, deceit, and killing are perfectly all right in order to save one's skin and in order to get ahead in the rat race. The morals of the stories include pragmatic advice, such as don't trust people, never let the enemy get the better of you, outwit others before they outwit and kill you. And the combination of action, wit, and sound common sense makes the Panchatantra as relevant today as it was hundreds of years ago. Now, this is a text that traveled a great deal, probably more than any other ancient Indian text. We know of a 6th century Persian Pahlavi translation, and then there was a translation into Arabic that was made in the 8th century. And many of the later translations of the Panchatantra were based on the Arabic translation. We know that the work had reached Europe by the 11th century, and by the 16th century, there were versions in English, Greek, Latin, Italian, Spanish, Czech, and Old Slavonic. Hertel, a leading scholar of the Panchatantra, counted over 200 versions in over 50 languages. And the influence of the Panchatantra stories have been traced to the Arabian Night stories, the fables of La Fontaine, and it is possible that some of the Sufi stories, which also have animal characters, were influenced by the Panchatantra tales. It's an interesting question, why did these stories travel so widely, both east and west? I think one of the important aspects I've already mentioned, that they really address issues of universal political and personal concern. And they were also very adaptable. So the prologue and the frame stories could be altered, and they were altered to suit different contexts. Let me give you just one example of a story in which the animal characters changed, showing us that unfamiliar animals could be changed into familiar ones. So there is a story which occurs, this is a frame story in book 5, which is a book that deals with hasty actions. And in this, in the Sanskrit Panchatantra talks about the main characters are a Brahman, a mongoose, Nakula, and a snake. Krishna Sarpa, I think is the word that is used. And in this story, a Brahman is taking care of his little baby boy. His wife has to go out, and suddenly the queen summons him for some kind of recitation in court. The Brahman is a poor Brahman and needs the money, and so he has to go. And he leaves his baby son in the care of a mongoose whom he loved a great deal and had brought up as though he were his own son. Brahman leaves, and then what happens is that a black snake comes into the room and is moving towards the child. When the mongoose sees this, no doubt also spurred on by the legendary enmity between snakes and mongooses, he leaps on the snake and he tears the snake to bits. When the Brahman comes home, having done his duty in court, the mongoose rushes out to, very happily with his mouth smeared with blood. The immediate reaction the Brahman has is that this mongoose has killed my son, and he takes a stick and beats it to death. And then he goes inside and finds the dead snake and his child lying unharmed, and he understands that he has made a very, very big mistake. Now, in the Arabic, and of course, then his wife comes and tells him, you should never do things in haste, and you should not react before you understand and comprehend situations properly. In the Arabic version, this story of the Brahman, mongoose, and snake became the story of a priest, a dog, and a snake. And in a Welsh version, in Wales, this became a story about a knight, a dog, and a wolf. So the animals could change and the morals could remain the same. Writing long histories of texts and ideas requires crossing vast chronological stretches extending from the remote past to our own time. It also requires crossing vast stretches of geographical space, moving across land and water, often far beyond the subcontinent. Such studies of texts are being written, and we need more of them. Let me just conclude. As a reaction to the frequent reference to foreign influence, the old diffusionist understandings of cultural change have been countered and replaced by an emphasis on indigenous evolution in spheres such as technology, art, and thought. However, beyond these two extremes is the possibility of tracing the travels of ideas historically, identifying the agents of transmission and their transformations as they settle down into distant and different cultural niches. I have largely looked at South and Southeast Asia, but really the canvas has to be broadened beyond that to include other parts of the world. Many questions arise when we look at the history of religion, ideas, and epigraphic practice within an Asian perspective. The most important questions have to do with the agents, mechanisms, and networks. Trade, war, and diplomacy created multiple networks of cultural interaction. And the most important vehicles of intellectual transmission were Brahmins learned in Sanskrit, Shastric, and literary traditions. Of course, there were also Buddhist monks. And as I've tried to emphasize in my lecture, the island of Sri Lanka, with its thriving, continuous, and strong Theravada tradition, and the close connections between state and Sangha, was an important node in these networks. Ideas also moved across Asia through diplomats and king-to-king contacts. Centers and agents of religious exchange were also centers and agents of a broader intellectual transmission and exchange in the ancient world. Much more needs to be understood about these processes. Let me just now tie up the loose threads. Reconstructing Asian interactions involves confronting unfamiliar terrain, unfamiliar histories, unfamiliar languages, and unfamiliar scripts. How are we going to build up the skills, especially the linguistic skills, to deal with the multilingual primary and secondary sources? Given the nature and range of the source material, it is not possible to do this in a meaningful way unless there is genuine collaboration among scholars from different countries and those from different disciplines, such as history, art history, archaeology, and epigraphy. It is not an either-or situation. Regional histories and local histories are very important and will continue to be important. But these need to be complemented by histories that move beyond local, regional, and subcontinental frames. I am convinced, and I hope that you are too, that our historical understanding will be enormously enriched if our canvas is broadened beyond India to include other parts of the world. Thank you.